Loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Thank you.
Can you raise your hand if you have a seat near you? Come right in.
Thank you, Fabu. Thank you. And thank you for also bringing things for people to look at afterwards from your grandfather. I mean, it sounds like he was an absolute fantastic contribution, as are many of the people in this room, including our speakers. My name is Peggy Wireman, and I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Committee for Black History Museum in Madison in celebration of Black History Month. Oh, okay, thank you. This project is not final. Like many projects, this one actually evolved from a tragedy. When Tony Robinson was killed, I was really upset, as were many, many people. But one of the things that I was upset about was the negative stereotypes that float around Madison. I came here from Washington, D.C. in the 80s, and I was absolutely shocked by the racism. And so I began thinking, I have a museum background, and I began thinking, you know, we need an exhibit of the contributions of Madison to African Americans, maybe a museum exhibit. And so I talked to some people, and they all said it was a good idea. And eventually, I was lucky enough to bump into Margaret Nealis and Donna Page, who is sitting at the corner back there, who kept encouraging me when I thought this was going nowhere. But anyhow, we ended up doing 19 interviews of 16 African Americans and 3 Caucasians in terms of what they would like on an exhibit about African Americans in Madison. Mostly what they said is they wanted to celebrate and share with their grandchildren. And then I didn't know what to do. Then we finished the report, and I called Greg Jones at the NAACP, and I said, how do we get people to read this report? And he said, well, let's have a meeting and see. This needs to go further. Let's have a meeting to see how it goes further. And at that meeting, which was actually on the 14th of November, he walked in and said, I think we need to do something for Black History Month. We all looked at him and they said, that's in February. And anyway, it happened thanks to many, 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 many people. I think that the thought is that this is not the end. This is actually the beginning of an effort for people who want to do more events, perhaps a museum exhibit, perhaps even a whole museum of Black history in Madison. So that's kind of what's next. Anybody who wants to help with more events, please, there's information on the back of your sheet about how to contact me or how to contact Greg. There's also information about the report. If you email me, I will send it to you. I also brought some copies for people who don't have email, and they're up here, and you may certainly have one. And I can get you one later. Now, what I'd like to do is to start introducing our illustrious speakers. Edith Lawrence Hilliard comes from one of the original African American families in Madison. Her great-great-great-grandfather came to Baraboo, Wisconsin in 1865, and then from Shreveport, Louisiana, and the family later moved to Madison. She has 3 adult children, 11 grandchildren, and 5 great-grandchildren who are 7th-generation Madisons. And with the Verona County Historical Society, they track their family history back to 1747. But I think what's most important for us in terms of the negative stereotyping is that her family has been in Wisconsin for 215 years. She has been presenting her family history at Edgewood College, and she's going to talk to us about her family history. She worked for 50 years, retired from her 3rd career as executive assistant to the director of the Newman Community Center. She has a degree in hospitality and tourism, and a whole page of organizations to which she has contributed and awards received, including the YMCA Women of Distinction. Please,
W is very important.
I can't speak. Anyway, please help me in welcoming her.
When I was at the Y, we always said the YW. The W is very important. And yes, I can trace my family history back to 1747, and that's a real blessing because I never had to go on Ancestry.com or anything like that. It was verbally passed down from one generation to the next. And then I found additional information at the Vernon County Historical Society. So it's been a real wonderful journey for me to be able to find out all that history. The first that I can trace it back to 1747 was my great-great-great-great-grandparents. And I had to write that down. That's a lot of greats. Yeah. And it was my grandfather. His name was Stephen Revel, and he was born in 1747. And his wife was Balella, and they were in North Carolina, and they lived on Cherokee land. So his native name was Longtime Hunter. And he supported his family through fishing and hunting and those kinds of things. And he unfortunately froze to death, and that's how he died. And from that generation, so that was the first generation that I can have knowledge of. The next generation, they were also on Cherokee land in North Carolina. And it's interesting that they lived on Cherokee land, and now I live in Cherokee Gardens. So history has come full circle. The next generation, the other interesting thing that I found is that they did not have a lot of children. There were very few children that were born in each one of the generations, and I thought that was very interesting because, as we know, there were no contraceptives back then. And so the generation that I know of personally was my grandmother and grandfather, who are pictured here. Where's Fabu's book? Fabu wrote a poetry book about my and there's poems in here about my grandmother and grandfather. Now, my grandfather came from Shreveport, Louisiana in 1866. When he came, he was 12 years old. The story that was told me, and again, passed down from one generation to the next, he was playing by the seashore, and a Captain Ephraim Hackett, who was a Quaker, asked him if he would be interested in going on a voyage. Well, again, he was only 12 years old, so he had to go home and ask his parents if he could do that. And his parents thought long and hard about it. Slavery had just ended, but there were no cell phones, Instagram, Facebook, or anything like that. So the word did not get out instantaneously. It took quite some time. So as they thought about it, they thought this would be a good thing for their son. Captain Hackett said, with him leaving, you might not ever have the opportunity to see him again. But they thought this would be a good opportunity for him to go north and have a free life. And so they let their son go. And unfortunately, he never did see his parents again. But they were assured that Captain Hackett would take care of him. Again, he was a Quaker and had a very good reputation. And we all know Quakers helped the slaves back then. And so as he was on the voyage, the ship was going to dock in Fairfield, Illinois. And Captain Hackett was going to raise my grandfather with his family. Halfway on the voyage, Captain Hackett died of consumption. And so now my grandfather was kind of left to fend for himself. The men on the ship were not quite as kind as Captain Hackett was. And when the ship docked in Fairfield, it then went on to Baraboo, Wisconsin, and Captain Hackett's brother, who was also a Quaker, said, "I'll take the young man and I will raise him with my family." And so he did. He took my grandfather in and raised him with his family, taught him a trade, and they lived in Baraboo for quite some time. My grandfather married an Indian woman. Her name was Cynthia, and to their union, 12 children were born. 6 boys and 6 girls. But out of those 12 children, only 4 of them had children. 3 of the girls and 1 of the boys had children. Again, very strange to me that there were just that few amount of children that were born. And so my grandfather and the children, they worked for the Circus World Museum. For many, many years. The girls worked in the home and they did hair. They grew long hair because they were half Native American, and they would grow their hair, they would cut it, and they would make what they called switches. And these are just really wigs, long wigs. That was the terminology that they used. And they had a wonderful life in Baraboo. And then some of them and my grandmother migrated to Madison, Wisconsin, the big metropolis of Madison, Wisconsin, from Baraboo. So that was a real big deal. And my grandmother worked on the University of Wisconsin campus as a cook for many years. And she was very involved in a lot of the things that went on in Madison. She was in the NAACP. Her husband was a Mason. And she was in the Mary Bethune Club, and active in civil rights and just all kinds of things. And what was interesting for me was she would drag me along to all of these things, and when they were having meetings and everything. But the other part of it was she was in the Mary Bethune Club, and there was agreement between my grandmother and I. If I was a good little girl, then she would take me along with her on some of these trips. And I have a picture up here, let me right underneath you, Dee. Oh, that's okay. And in this picture, and afterwards I'll have you come up and see it. I'm pictured in this picture as a little girl at one of these meetings, which was really kind of fun. And so if I was good, I could go along. And the first time we went to Washington, D.C. for a meeting, and I was the only child there. I think it was 8 or 9 years old. And the ladies would take me shopping, and they would buy me gloves and hats and shoes and dresses and everything. And I wasn't a dumb child. I figured out that if I was a good little girl, I was going to be able to go and get all of these nice things. So it was really fun for me, and it was very educational. I've been involved in a lot of things here in Madison, and I know that stems from the relationship that I had with my grandmother and all of the things that she took me to. At a very young age, it wasn't very interesting to me, but as I got older, I got smarter and wiser, and it was very interesting to me. The other part of my family, and again, I'll invite you to come up later and see pictures, was my cousin, Robert H. Lawrence Jr. He was the first African-American astronaut in the nation. And Robert was very intelligent. He was born, thank you for that. He was born in Chicago, Illinois, and he graduated from high school when he was 16 years old. He went into college and graduated with a 4-year degree in chemical science, went on to Bradley University and graduated there, and then went on to Ohio State University, and at the age of 27, he obtained a PhD and went into the Air Force. Once he was in the Air Force, he was a part of a scientific program, and his mission was to go up into space and do scientific testing while he was in space. There were 3 men that were selected to be astronauts in this program. Robert was the youngest one in the program, the only African American in the program, and the only one with a PhD. Wow. Again, he was a very intelligent young man.
Was he treated respectfully on those endeavors?
Absolutely not. Back there in those days, there weren't any affirmative actions or anything like that. I mean, even getting through school was very difficult for him, but he excelled in every single thing that he did, all the way through. Graduating from high school at the age 16, a PhD at the age 27, these were not easy things for him to do. And even when he became an astronaut, This was very difficult also. Like I said, he was the youngest one and the only one with a PhD. But unfortunately, what happened in 1967, he was supposed to go on this space mission, and he was killed in a test flight mission. Now, he was an astronaut, but he was an African American astronaut. So for 30 years, the conversation was, well, you know, he really didn't go up into space, so was he really an astronaut? It went on for 30 years. And finally, President Clinton said, wait a minute. He was an astronaut in the program. He was an astronaut. He was the first African American astronaut in the nation. And so I was able to go, and again, there's a picture here. The entire family went to a celebration at Cape Canaveral. There's a picture here of the entire family that went, and they celebrated him being the first African American astronaut in the nation. And I was very blessed to be able to go to that celebration. There were many honors that were given to him at the time, and they also made a lovely plaque. I'll kind of hold it up, but again, you can come up and see it. Thank you, Mary. So there's this plaque, and on this plaque, it has all of the names of the astronauts that were killed in the line of duty. And it just has the sun in there. It's just a really beautiful symbol of what he had done. Also, it was interesting that Miss Malele had a Umoja cover, and here he is on the cover of Umoja magazine. So, and also with my family history, we have another Umoja cover here. And on this Umoja cover are my great aunt Mamie down in the corner. And she, if you look real close, she looks like she's white. And when Aunt Mamie went to the University of Wisconsin, she had to pass for white. And when she graduated, she asked them to change her diploma. Guess what? To black. But they wouldn't do it. And so it stayed on there that she was white when she graduated from the University of Wisconsin. And my father is also pictured here. Both of them are deceased. I'm in the picture, and my son and my grandson are in this picture. Again, this is a Umoja cover. So this is kind of my family history. Here, I have a picture here. This is the old homestead in Baraboo, Wisconsin, where my great-grandmother and grandfather raised 12 children. So, you know, when we're all done, you can come up and see these pictures. Also, Hurtis, I have a picture of you up here when you were a Mason. Bee and I were trying to figure out if that was you, and it is you in this picture. And it's a real historic picture because there are a lot of African Americans that are no longer here that are in that picture. So I'm going to have you have a look at it, and maybe you can help me figure out the name of some of the others. And so I thank you very much for listening to me, and I enjoyed speaking with you.
Well, I will in just a second, but I wanted to ask just one question. You talked to us about family, and clearly you grew up in a really tremendous family. But you also grew up in Madison at a time when it was not necessarily an easy time to grow up. And I want to know if there's anything else you'd like to say about that.
You know, it was an easy time to grow up here. And the reason I say that, and Roxanne can attest to this, and Bee can attest to this, there weren't very many African Americans here in Madison. And so, you know, when there aren't many, you aren't a threat. And so we really weren't a threat here because there were so few of us. It was like a big family. You know, a lot of us lived on the south side, and we all hung out together, and with the Italians, you know, in the bush, and we just didn't have any problems.
That's because, see, Madison, not as long as a community, they didn't want to put no money into our facility. Always figured the black people, the minorities, over there on the south side, we don't fix these streets, we don't fix their park, they finally fixed the park, thank you. Tell the Madison mayor, thank you. But other than that, they refuse to see us as a community, they still refuse to see us as a community. We need to get out and vote and get some people who are, you know, in our environment to help us in the city. South Madison particularly, they forgot about us, west side, north side, everybody got, and they got problems too, but whenever shit happens on the south side, it's amplified. I'm sick and tired of that.
But you said a key thing, get out and vote. That's how we're gonna change things. Because we have to get out and vote. So voting is coming up, so we're hoping that everybody here will get out and vote. Roxanne?
And fill out the census form, please.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to introduce Shar, who I think will introduce her mother to us. And Shar is the granddaughter of James Braxton and mother Mary Lee Barton, and the daughter of B. Chapman, who is here. Thank you so much. And her grandparents played a huge role in fighting for rights of African Americans in Madison. They were one of the first black families to arrive. They did face racism, and they still kept proceeding. The thing that appealed to me most interesting as I was reading this bio is she took 4 semesters of Chinese at UW and fell in love with the language and now wants to go to China to teach English. And I've been, well, not now, later. I've been to China, and normally I recommend it. She's currently enrolled at Madison College, and she'll transfer to UW to pursue degrees in Chinese literature, film, and creative writing. She's also already started with her creative writing, and last year she won the Midwest Writers Institute Poetry Contest. She will teach English in China when it's safe and write a bestseller. She's also been nominated for this year's Exemplary Learner of the Year Award at Madison College. And finally, her grandfather, grandmother, and mom had been very instrumental in helping her achieve her dreams.
All right.
Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I'm truly honored to be able to come here and speak about African Americans and just human life and us connecting together. I guess here's my lovely mother, B. Chapman. And I also have a niece in the audience, Shante Braxton, right here, and my brother Don's daughter.
And you got a sister-in-law.
Okay. Not in-law. I call Carrie my sister-in-law. Because for me, when you use in-law, I don't want to talk to you. Carrie, I love dearly. So thank you, Carrie, for bringing that out. I'm going to start with a great, great, great uncle of mine, or would have been my grandmother's uncle. His name would have been Iverson Granderson. My Aunt Jeanette wrote a book about him, and he actually was a colored boy in the Navy. And you can imagine being a runaway slave at that time. So the book is on Amazon, and it's The First Class Colored Boy, Union Navy, 1863 to 1865. As we know, being a runaway slave, you don't have your birthday, do you? So there's a lot of things that have to do with filing forms with the government. And of course, you will not be accepted because you're not considered a human being. I don't know your date of birth. So he went through a lot of, challenges just trying to get the benefits that were due him. And so that story my Aunt Jeanette wrote about, and I know that she is also going to be tracing our family roots back to Africa. What I can tell you about, though, is my grandmother and my grandfather. Just from growing up, my grandfather, he was real strict. If you were on time for an event, you were actually late, okay? That's how my grandfather was. I think, Curtis, you can speak to that.
Yeah, I know one.
With being a Mason, okay? So, my grandfather was born in Mississippi, March 26, 1918. So you can imagine the conditions that he had to face growing up. My grandfather was not a yes, sir man. Okay, not at all. Okay? That was one of the reasons why he left the South. Okay? And he left the South a very bitter man. He came here to Madison, Wisconsin in the early 1940s. And I guess sometimes you realize you leave one geographical area of the United States and you find out that there's also racism there, but it's hidden. It is very hidden. But there were a lot of more opportunities here in the North. And one of the opportunities that my grandfather had, and I may not be going in chronological order here because I am very nervous, is the fact that he was a follower of the NAACP, and he served as the chair of the Equal Opportunities Commission, housing for 11 years. My grandfather owned his own cleaners, the first African American to open their own cleaners here in Madison, Wisconsin. He also worked at Oscar Myers. I think one of the articles here was saying that 70 cents an hour. Can you imagine bringing home 70 cents an hour? And he wasn't treated well at Oscar Myers. I remember my grandfather actually telling me that they had cornered him in the meat packing room one time, and they were actually trying to kill my grandfather at Oscar Myers. My grandfather did not have a good relationship with the management because of their racial views. And so he did leave Oscar Myers. They promised him pay and welding, and they didn't adhere to that. And then he went and worked elsewhere, but he did go back, but he didn't stay. There is another thing. I'm going to give a shout out to Muriel Sims. The book that she wrote, Settling, Stories of Madison's Early African American Families. In here, she referenced my grandfather, and he talked a lot about the poor treatment and pay that he experienced in the South, and that really motivated him to come up north. The other thing was that during World War II, jobs opened up, as I said, at Oscar Myers, and then my grandfather, I guess if you had to live in Madison to know about Badger Candy Kitchen. That was on the square. It was the place to go to get your candies. And so my grandfather was actually clean there. And after the 1950s, he went and worked at the Veterans Administration Hospital, where he became a union activist. And then he went on, and like I said, he opened up his own cleaners, and he worked for himself. As a young girl, every stitch of clothing that I had went to that cleaners, okay? Yes, it did. I had a grandfather. He would clean my clothes. It was awesome, okay? So yes, we dropped our piles of clothes off a lot. The other thing I can remember about my grandfather is that he did win a lot of service awards. One of the awards here is from this certificate is awarded to James Braxton by the Veterans Administration in appreciation of 27 years of faithful service to the United States government.
What year was that?
This was in October 9th, 1980. Okay? Another award, Capital City Lodge, number 2, Certificate of Achievement for long-time service presented to Brother James Braxton. Okay? And my grandfather,
What year was that? That Capital City Lodge?
Sunday, May 19th, 2002.
Okay.
Okay?
Tell me something about the Capital City Lodge. I never heard of it. I've been there all my life. I'm 54 years old. I ain't never heard of Capital City Lodge.
Well, I'm going to let you refer that question to Hurtis, okay? And he can do that afterwards. Another thing, James Braxton, in appreciation for your dedicated service on the Parks Commission. One of the awards that my grandfather got that means a lot to me was from the NAACP Unsung Hero Service Award, presented to James Braxton. Kirby Mack was the branch president at that time, and this was on October 4th, 2002. So I'm just going to tell you my history with my grandfather. I loved him dearly. I know that he cared a lot about people, and he basically, what can I say? Oh gosh, he would sit on that bridge on Williamson Street. If anyone knows, you would go down Williamson Street, and my grandfather, you might see him sitting on the bridge, and he would wave to you. Alan, you remember that? Okay, well, Alan remembers that. Okay, we used to go to his house at family times, and my grandfather would always make homemade vanilla ice cream, okay? Can you imagine that? So, yes, I am very particular. Really, I don't like the store-bought ice cream because I had the real thing. And if it was July, and my mom would make homemade peach cobbler. So can you imagine those two things together? Okay? So that's what I have to say about my grandpa. My grandpa was married to my grandmother, Mary Lee Martin. Mary Lee Martin, oh my gosh, there's so many things that I can say about my grandma. The one thing that I can tell you is that she was a dresser, okay? You see this I have on? This actually is one of a jacket that my grandmother wore, okay? My grandmother was a dresser. My grandmother believed in God. My grandmother could sing. My grandmother was a resource to African Americans when they came here. So there was a woman. She was a community organizer, and her name was Miss Willie Harris.